Tom Bauer, welcome to The Breakfast Show. This week, a huge week for you, my friend. 26, the book's out. Betrayal, Power, Deceit and the Fight for the Future of the Royal Family. And the reason there's so much talk about this book is this claim of yours, this astonishing statement said to be made by Queen Camilla to a friend, this is in the book, that Camilla said, and I quote about Harry and Meghan, she's been brainwashing him. They have kicked back already, Tom, ahead of publication. Harry and Meghan saying that this is deranged conspiracy, my friend. How do you answer that?
Well, I'm firstly grateful to them because they pushed the book up to #1 on Amazon. And secondly, I'm not surprised. I mean, for them, any criticism is always poisonous and damaging, and particularly from me. But I can assure you it's very well sourced from the person who heard it from the Queen's mouth. And it's true. I mean, that's the point. It is actually, unfortunately, true.
For weeks, Meghan's path back into the royal conversation appeared to be quietly taking shape. Carefully chosen appearances, warmer signals, and whispers of reconciliation suggested the atmosphere was changing. But just as that comeback seemed possible, Tom Bauer raised a completely different problem. One nobody around Meghan appeared ready to answer. The shift was subtle, but impossible to ignore. Meghan no longer seemed completely frozen outside the royal story. The possibility of renewed contact, softened relationships, and a different public chapter had begun to feel less distant. Yet this was never simply about returning to palace duties. The deeper issue was influence, legitimacy, access, and whether Meghan could once again occupy a meaningful place around the institution that had defined so much of her public life. For years, the obstacles had seemed familiar. Harry's strained relationship with William, the security battles, the media war, questions of trust, old wounds that never appeared fully settled. Those problems were serious, but they were known. Bauer's intervention changed the equation because he pointed toward something less personal and potentially far more difficult to repair: institutional memory. The palace, after all, does not forget easily. Senior officials could survive criticism. They could manage hostile headlines. They could even tolerate another burst of public controversy. But reopening access to someone after years of tension would require something more dangerous than good publicity. It would require confidence that the circumstances behind the original rupture had fundamentally changed. That was where Meghan's position became complicated. She might have expected resistance from William. She might have anticipated caution from palace advisors. Those were visible obstacles. The greater threat was the possibility that the institution itself had built protective habits around her absence, boundaries, procedures, expectations, and unspoken rules designed specifically to prevent old tensions from returning. And once those protections exist, removing them becomes harder than creating them. This meant the real debate was no longer simply about whether Meghan wanted peace or whether Harry wanted his family back. It was about whether the monarchy believed reconciliation could happen without giving up the control it had fought to regain. And once the argument shifted from Meghan's intentions to the palace's fear of what might happen afterward, the comeback suddenly faced a problem far more dangerous than another round of bad headlines. The most explosive part of Bauer's warning was not the suggestion that Meghan might return to Britain or appear beside the royals again. It was what could follow that moment. Because behind palace walls, one question would dominate every discussion: what happens after access is restored and the doors begin closing again? That question changed the nature of the comeback entirely. Royal life depends on discretion. Private conversations are expected to remain private. Small gestures, tense exchanges, seating decisions, personal disagreements, even moments of vulnerability are rarely meant to become part of a wider public story. Without that understanding, the institution becomes almost impossible to manage. And that is where the deeper concern begins. A successful appearance could calm headlines. A carefully handled reunion could soften public tension. Even a warm exchange with Charles might suggest that old wounds were beginning to heal. But none of those things could automatically rebuild private confidence. Trust inside the monarchy is not measured by applause. It is measured by what happens when there are no cameras, no statements, and no immediate audience. Bauer's warning, therefore, pushes the conflict beyond personality. The fear is structural. If senior royals begin questioning whether every private conversation might someday be described, interpreted, or retold publicly, then normal family contact becomes loaded with risk. Harry sits directly in the middle of that problem. He may want reconciliation badly enough to believe that new boundaries can be respected. But the palace could demand something harder than goodwill. It could demand certainty. And certainty is almost impossible when the people involved now live outside royal control. For Meghan, the contradiction is brutal. Real reconciliation would require private access, honest conversations, and room to rebuild relationships away from public scrutiny. Yet those are precisely the spaces palace officials may be most reluctant to reopen. William's position becomes especially important here. His concern would not have to come from personal hostility alone. As heir, husband, and father, he could see himself as protecting Catherine, his children, and the future monarchy from another period of uncertainty. And that leads directly to the most sensitive issue of all, private family information. Once access is restored, information begins to flow naturally, and unlike invitations or ceremony, information cannot simply be taken back. But trust was only the first layer, because Bauer's warning carried another implication. Even if Meghan promised absolute privacy, there was still something the future king could never completely control once she returned. To outsiders, the conflict could look painfully simple. Two brothers, two wives, years of resentment, and one possible reconciliation. But inside the monarchy, William would be forced to think beyond emotion. His decisions would affect not merely his relationship with Harry, but the institution he is expected to inherit. That changes everything. William is not dealing only with the pain of a fractured family. He is also carrying the burden of succession, where every compromise can become a precedent and every exception can shape what comes next. A private invitation today could influence expectations tomorrow. A family appearance could quickly become a question of status. A simple gesture of goodwill might be interpreted as something much larger. That is why Meghan's possible return creates a problem no emotional reunion can solve on its own. What exactly would her position be? Would she return simply as Harry's wife, joining private family moments without any official role? Would she be treated as a high-profile guest whose presence attracts global attention? Or would certain invitations, ceremonies, and forms of recognition begin to suggest that her royal standing was quietly being restored? Each possibility comes with different expectations. William would understand that access means more than opening a door. It affects who attends private gatherings, who receives sensitive information, who appears at major royal occasions, and where the line is drawn between family connection and institutional privilege. Catherine adds another layer to the pressure. William may be unwilling to place her in situations where unresolved distrust must suddenly disappear behind formal smiles and ceremonial courtesy. Protecting the future monarchy would also mean protecting the emotional stability of the people expected to carry it. And this is where Meghan could encounter the most frustrating contradiction yet. Charles might choose warmth. Other relatives might welcome renewed contact. Personal relationships could slowly begin to repair. Yet William could still hold a firm institutional boundary, separating family forgiveness from royal access. That would leave Meghan negotiating with two different worlds at once: the family that exists today and the monarchy William believes he must protect for tomorrow. And just when that distinction seemed complicated enough, another question emerged, because Meghan's royal connection had never been about relationships alone. Titles, privileges, invitations, and symbolism were quietly waiting underneath. A royal comeback is never just a reunion. Every invitation carries status. Every seating position sends a signal. Every title, escort, entrance, residence, and photograph can become a declaration of who still belongs. And suddenly, Meghan's possible return threatened to reopen questions the palace believed had already been painfully settled. That was where symbolism became dangerous. Inside the monarchy, details that might appear trivial to outsiders can carry enormous meaning. How Meghan is addressed, where she sits, who accompanies her, whether she stays on royal property, and whether she appears in official photographs could all be read as clues about her position. One small concession could create a much larger interpretation. For Meghan, certain courtesies might simply represent dignity and respect. After everything that had happened, being treated warmly and visibly as part of the family could feel essential to any genuine reconciliation. But palace officials could see the same gestures very differently. A prominent seat, a formal entrance, or inclusion in an official moment might blur boundaries that had taken years to establish. That tension would inevitably pull Harry deeper into the conflict. If he believed Meghan was being welcomed privately but diminished publicly, reconciliation could begin to feel hollow. He could accept limits on royal duties, yet still resist anything that appeared designed to remind Meghan that she stood outside the institution. What the palace called clarity, Harry might see as humiliation. William's position would likely remain firmer. Private warmth, in his view, could not automatically restore institutional privilege. Family relationships could heal without changing the structure of the monarchy. And once that distinction was weakened, every future invitation could reopen the same argument. Charles would be caught between both sides. As a father, he might want contact with Harry without endless conditions. As king, he would also understand that monarchy depends on hierarchy, roles, and signals that cannot always be separated from emotion. This is where Bower's new problem became much larger. The question was no longer simply whether Meghan could return. It was what returning would actually mean. And beneath that debate waited something far more sensitive than protocol, because beneath every argument over rank and recognition stood a woman whose memory still shaped both brothers, and once Diana's legacy entered the conversation, the conflict became intensely personal. For Harry, Diana has always represented loss, protection, rebellion, and unfinished pain. For William, she is equally sacred, but guarded differently. And according to the growing argument around Meghan's comeback, any renewed attempt to connect her story with Diana's could trigger the one confrontation neither brother knows how to contain. This is where the conflict stops being about protocol and becomes deeply personal. Diana's memory is not simply part of royal history for William and Harry. It sits at the center of how both men understand family, loyalty, pressure, and loss. But they have carried that memory in very different ways. Harry has often viewed Meghan's experience through the emotional shadow of his mother. To him, the parallels may help explain why he reacted so fiercely whenever he believed royal life, public scrutiny, or institutional pressure was becoming dangerous. In that sense, defending Meghan could feel tied to a promise he never had the chance to make to Diana. William could see the same comparisons very differently. For him, repeated attempts to connect Meghan with Diana could feel like something private being pulled into another modern conflict. The more Diana's name is attached to arguments about treatment, status, press attention, or royal exclusion, the harder it becomes to keep her memory separate from the brothers' present-day divisions. That danger would only grow if Meghan returned to important royal occasions. Her clothes could be compared. Her position could be analyzed. Her treatment could be measured against Diana's. And then there is jewelry. A bracelet, ring, watch, or other inherited object might carry enormous emotional meaning long before its financial value matters. If Meghan wore a Diana-linked piece during a major reunion, palace advisors could fear that the symbolism would instantly overwhelm the event itself. Harry, however, may refuse any suggestion that his connection to his mother should be controlled by palace strategy. William could answer that Diana's legacy belongs to neither brother exclusively, and should not become ammunition in their dispute. That is what makes this fault line so dangerous. There is no protocol capable of settling grief, ownership of memory, or emotional inheritance. Yet the palace could still restrict ceremonies and protect symbols. What it could not control so easily was the most unpredictable element of all, the public story Meghan might tell about what happened next. Imagine the reunion succeeds. Meghan enters quietly. Conversations happen. Hands are shaken. Old tensions appear to soften. Then comes the question palace officials cannot avoid. 6 months later, does any part of that experience become an interview, a documentary conversation, a memoir chapter, or a carefully worded public reflection? That possibility makes media power one of the hardest obstacles in any comeback. Meghan would not need to attack the monarchy for the palace to feel exposed. Even a calm account of a private meeting could become an international story within hours. A brief comment about Charles, William, Catherine, or the atmosphere inside a family gathering could be analyzed far beyond its original meaning. And that is precisely why private confidence becomes so difficult to rebuild. Meghan may believe she has every right to speak about her own experiences. From her perspective, silence cannot be the price of family acceptance. Yet the palace could view the same experiences as part of a confidential world, where relationships survive only because certain conversations remain protected. Harry would be trapped between those two positions. He could defend Meghan's independence while simultaneously asking his relatives to trust that renewed contact would stay private. But those promises become harder to make when neither Harry nor the palace can control what might happen years later. Interviews can be requested. Books can be written. Podcasts can return. Friends may speak. Sources may offer competing versions. Even a documentary made with careful intentions could reopen questions everyone believed had finally settled. This is where Bauer's argument gains its sharpest edge. No handshake can guarantee permanent silence. No private agreement can completely control future choices. Worse still, silence creates its own problem. If Meghan returns and says nothing, speculation could fill the gap. Commentators would search for hidden meaning. Anonymous claims could multiply. But if she eventually explains what happened, palace officials might point to that very moment as proof that their caution was justified. The contradiction is almost impossible to escape. The more dramatic and meaningful the reconciliation becomes, the more valuable the story surrounding it becomes to everyone outside the family. And that paradox would leave Charles facing a decision only the monarch could make, whether protecting his family required opening the door or keeping part of it permanently locked. For Charles, the problem could no longer be solved by avoiding a meeting or postponing another invitation. The stakes had become personal. One path might cost him precious time with Harry and his grandchildren. The other could reopen exactly the turmoil senior royals had spent years trying to contain. Unlike William, Charles would not be thinking only about the future shape of the monarchy. He would also be confronting something far more human: time. Family fractures can continue for years, but years are not unlimited. Every delayed conversation becomes another missed opportunity, and every postponed reunion carries the risk that distance eventually becomes permanent. Harry could believe his father still possesses the authority to break the deadlock. If Charles truly wanted reconciliation, then perhaps one decision from the king could create space for Meghan to return to family contact without endless suspicion surrounding every step. But William could see danger in exactly that approach. A decision made from emotion today could create expectations that survive long after Charles is no longer making them. If boundaries are softened now, William may one day inherit not only the crown, but also a complicated set of promises he never agreed to make. That is why palace advisors might push toward a compromise, private contact, carefully protected, without restoring Meghan to a visible ceremonial position. On paper, it sounds simple. In reality, it could satisfy almost nobody. Harry might see it as an insult, Meghan welcomed behind closed doors but kept at a distance whenever the monarchy appears publicly. Meghan could interpret those restrictions as proof that the palace wants reconciliation only under conditions it controls, without fully acknowledging the grievances that drove the original break. Charles would then face the cruelest part of the dilemma: reassure Harry, and William may believe institutional caution has been sacrificed. Reassure William, and Harry may see another moment when the monarchy came before family. There would be no painless decision. And for Meghan, the consequences would soon become impossible to avoid, because being allowed back under strict limits raises a question more uncomfortable than outright rejection. If the palace defines every condition of the return, is it really a comeback at all? Because once the conditions became clearer, Meghan faced a choice nobody had expected: fight for the return she originally imagined, or accept a version of reconciliation that looked completely different. This was where Bower's warning finally landed with full force. Meghan might still be welcomed into certain family spaces, she might still see Charles. She might even attend carefully chosen occasions. But the version of the comeback being quietly imagined around her came with conditions capable of changing everything. The distinction was becoming impossible to ignore. Reconciliation was one thing, restoration was another. The palace might accept private contact, warmer family conversations, and limited appearances without offering anything close to the position Meghan once held within royal life. That could mean carefully controlled invitations, restricted access, select ceremonial appearances, no automatic place besides senior working royals, no guarantee that one successful reunion would lead to another. Technically, Meghan could be back. Emotionally, she could still feel outside. That is where the arrangement becomes painful. Every invitation might carry an invisible reminder that the old position no longer exists. Every boundary could feel less like protocol and more like a test. And if Meghan were expected to repeatedly demonstrate restraint before receiving greater trust, the process itself could become exhausting. Harry might find that especially difficult to accept. From his perspective, Meghan could be asked to prove herself openly, while other family tensions remain protected by palace silence. He may see that imbalance as another example of the institution controlling the terms of reconciliation without exposing its own weaknesses. But then Meghan faces a possibility that changes the power dynamic entirely. What if the strongest comeback is not a royal return? What if refusing tightly controlled conditions allows her to show that her influence, public identity, and future no longer depend on palace recognition? That would transform Bower's warning into something neither side could easily predict. The palace might believe it still holds the power because it controls access, ceremonies, and status. Meghan, however, could decide that rejecting those limits gives her a different kind of control, the freedom to define success without royal approval. Suddenly, the battle would no longer be about who receives an invitation, it would be about who needs the other more. The public might wait for an explosive confrontation, but the deeper struggle would be quieter. Who moves first? Who refuses to move? And who can endure the silence longest? Then came the final twist, because the new problem Bauer had exposed did not leave Meghan powerless. It left both sides trapped inside a confrontation where every possible decision carried consequences. By this point, the comeback no longer depended on one invitation, one apology, or even one private meeting. Bauer's warning had exposed something deeper. Meghan and the monarchy were approaching reconciliation with completely different definitions of what trust, privacy, dignity, and belonging were supposed to mean. That was the real deadlock. Meghan could accept tightly controlled contact and slowly rebuild family relationships. But doing so might weaken any sense of a triumphant return. Every restriction would remind her that access had conditions. Every appearance could become evidence that the palace, not Meghan, still defined the limits. Yet rejecting those terms carried its own risk. Independence might be preserved, but critics could argue that reconciliation was only acceptable when it happened on Meghan's terms. Either path could be interpreted as defeat. Harry was trapped most painfully of all. Loyalty to Meghan had shaped many of his decisions, but rebuilding trust with Charles and William would demand patience, restraint, and proof that old patterns would not return. He could not satisfy one side without the other, wondering what had been sacrificed. William's position remained firm. As the future king, he could not simply rely on promises. He would want stability demonstrated over time, especially where privacy, public narratives, titles, and access were concerned. Charles, meanwhile, might search desperately for a middle path, a private relationship strong enough to heal the family, but limited enough to protect the institution. The problem was that royal compromises often postpone conflict rather than remove it. That is what Bauer's warning ultimately changed. The question was no longer whether Meghan could return. The harder question was whether the Sussexes and the palace could ever agree on rules that both sides considered fair. A meeting could still happen. Communication could improve. Meghan might one day appear beside members of the family again. But none of those moments would automatically erase the invisible struggle over trust. And if Meghan eventually walks through that royal doorway, nobody may immediately know what it means. Forgiveness? Strategic necessity? A genuine new beginning? Or simply the opening move in another conflict waiting beneath the surface? And until that question is answered, Meghan's comeback remains suspended between two possibilities: an extraordinary royal reconciliation, or the moment everyone finally realizes that some doors can reopen without ever leading back to the same place.